This is our sixth video in a series looking at the kind of calculations which we routinely carry out in molecular biology. In the previous episodes, we've thought about the units and powers that we encounter in calculations of this sort. We thought about some kinds of mole calculations that we do particularly in biochemistry. And then we thought about typical volume and dilution type calculations, moving on from there to think about solutions that have multiple different components going into them. Now, if you haven't watched those previous videos, the last two in particular will be useful background before this current video. In this video, we're moving on to consider calculations where it will turn out that we need to make an intermediate solution of some sort in order to get from our starting position, be that a solid or a solution of a stronger concentration, through to the final concentrations that we want at the end. So here's an example. What mass of anhydrous sodium carbonate, relative molecular mass 106, would be needed to make 300 millilitres of a 200 micromolar solution? And you're asked to note that the balance that you've got available to you can only weigh to a minimum of 0.1 grams. How would you actually do this? Now, both the inclusion of a comment about the limited scope of the balance and also the how would you actually do this are clues in the question there that we're not going to be able to go straight from our starting solid through to our final solution. To begin with though, let's just imagine and picture why that's a problem. Why can't we go from the solid to our final solution? So what we want to end up with is 300 millilitres at 200 micromolar. Now, as I've demonstrated in previous videos, I would solve this question by starting to attack this from the units. So 200 micromolar means 200 micromoles per litre. But I don't have a litre, I've got 300 millilitres. So I want to know what that is in millilitres. And so 200 micromolar also means 200 nanomoles per milliliter. I've got 300 of those, so I've got 300 lots of 200, 60,000 nanomoles. We obviously wouldn't leave it looking like that. So that's 60 micromoles. So far so good. It's 60 micromoles of sodium carbonate that I want at the end. Okay, well let's equate that now to trying to make that from the solid. So 1 mole we know by definition is 106 grams for the sodium carbonate. 1 millimole therefore will be 106 milligrams, and 1 micromole will be 106 micrograms. We can see that we've got 60 of those, so in total we're going to have 60 times 106 micrograms, which is 6,260 micrograms. Obviously, again, wouldn't leave it described like that. That's 6.36 milligrams. Now, it's worth just mentioning in passing that that would be 0.00636 grams. And that just poses the scale of the problem. And that relates back to our reservation that was included in the question, that our balance can only measure accurately to 0.1 grams or 100 milligrams. So clearly we are a long way beyond the scope of what we could do with the equipment that we've got available to us. So what are we going to do? Well, the solution therefore, no pun intended, is to go through an intermediate solution. And we probably can make it in one step, but initially you perhaps would think, well, maybe I need to use more than one step along the way. So I've said solution or solutions there. Okay, now one of the things that really flummoxes people about the need to make an intermediate solution is that you don't have a clear guide as to what concentration or what volumes you're going to be needing to use, and that can throw people off kilter. And there is no right or wrong answer. So you could choose a particular concentration or a different concentration. You could make different volumes of it. There are no right and wrongs, but there are better and worse solutions that you can make. And those can be determined by a number of factors. For example, you want to make something that's in the middle of the range to begin with, at least to do the calculation to see whether that will work. and also to use numbers that are going to be easy calculations for you. Of course, with some materials which are expensive, you're also going to want to try and minimise how much of the starting material you're going to waste, because there is inevitably some waste in having to make an intermediate solution or two. So here we're going to aim in the first instance to make something that's 200 millimolar solution rather than 200 micromolar. So that's 1,000 times more concentrated. So we're going to make a 200 millimolar intermediate, and we saw previously that 1 millimole has a mass of 106 milligrams. And we've told that our balance can only go accurately to 0.1 grams. Now, you could pick 0.1 grams, you could have picked 0.2 grams, you could have picked 0.17, well, you couldn't, but you see the point that I'm making. Now I've picked 0.3 grams. That's partly because I'm aiming slightly above the minimum threshold of my equipment, but also because in this particular case I've chosen 0.3 rather than 0.2 because we're talking about 0.2 molar solution. So to keep the numbers distinct from one another, I've gone for 0.3. So the point is that number is your choice. You can pick whatever would work for you. So what we're going to need then is 300 milligrams. We know that 1 millimole is 106 milligrams, and so in terms of how many moles we'd have in 300 milligrams, that's going to be 300 divided by 106, or 2.83 millimoles. Our stock solution, our intermediate stock that we're going to make, is 200 millimolar. So that's 200 millimoles per litre. And in other words, that's 1 millimole per 5 millilitres. So I know that each 1 millimole will require 5 millilitres of liquid. And we're going to need to make 2.83 millimoles. And so that's our total volume that we're going to make for our intermediate solution, 2.83, which is the number of millimoles, multiplied by the volume, 5 millilitres. We're going to need a total of 14.15 millilitres. Now, that might sound an awkward sort of number, but actually it's fairly straightforward to make. We can make that using a 5 ml pipette to work out that the first 14 millilitres. Obviously we've got to use it 3 times to do so, but then we can add 150 microlitres using a P200, so a 200 microlitre maximum volume pipette. And so that's relatively easy to do, and certainly easier than the limitations we had previously with the issues with our balance. Now, of course, we're not quite there yet. We're only halfway to making our solution that we really want. And so we need to make 300 millilitres of a 200 micromolar solution. And so I can return to my usual calculation. The initial volume multiplied by the initial concentration is the final volume multiplied by the final concentration, or sometimes again, starting volume times starting concentration is the final volume times the final concentration. I can put in the numbers that I know. So I now know that my intermediate stock that I'm making is 200 millimolar. I know that my final volume is 300 millilitres. I know that my final concentration is 200 micromolar. So again, I'm noting to begin with that the units of concentration are different on the two sides at the moment. So to avoid falling into a trap of making a factor of 10 or a factor of 1,000 type error, I'm going to make sure they're the same. And so my unknown, which I'm now stating I know is in millilitres because this was in millilitres, because I've converted the final unit here to be the same as the one on the left hand side. So my unknown times 200 is going to be 300 times 0.2, or in other words 300 times 0.2 divided by 200, which is going to be 0.3 millilitres or 300 microlitres. So to make my final solution from that intermediate, I'm going to need to take 300 microlitres and transfer that into 299.7 millilitres of distilled water. And that will then enable me to make my desired final solution. Okay, so that was a worked example. Let's try one We're starting this time actually from a stronger solution to begin with, but it's the same principle. You have 50 milligrams per milliliter of a stock solution of bovine serum albumin, BSA. How would you make up 0.5 mils of a 2 microgram per mil solution? And note that you cannot accurately pipette volumes lower than 0.1 microliters. And it's worth noting that you really wouldn't want to push it to that level anyway. You try to have a slightly larger volume than that, but certainly you can't go below 0.1 microliter. So what I'd suggest is that you pause this video for a moment, try and work through that calculation for yourself, and then I'll show you one way that I would do that. Okay, well, let's have a look and see why it is that we need to use an intermediate in this case. If I was to try to go straight from the stock solution at 50 mg per mil through to my final concentration at 2 micrograms per mil, here would be the difficulty. So I'm starting with, as always, initial volume times initial concentration is final volume times final concentration. I know that my stock concentration is 50 mg per mil. I know that my final concentration is 2 micrograms per mil. If I was to work through this, and there are some red flags that should come up here quite quickly, I'm going to make sure that the unit's the same on both sides. So I'm going to change my 50 mg per mil to be 50,000 micrograms per mil, which is the same. But clearly 50,000 on one side and 2 on the other presents us straight away with a problem. I now know that my unknown is going to be in microliters, and my unknown microliters equals 500 times 2 divided by 50,000, or 0.02 microliters. And we know from the question that an absolute push, our accuracy can't go below 0.1 microliters. So you can't do it directly. We're going to have to invoke some kind of intermediate. So in terms of the choices to make, again, this is where it can be slightly unnerving because you can choose whatever concentration you want. I'm going to pick something that's relatively simple here. So I'm going to work back from my final intended concentration of 2 micrograms per mil to have an intermediate that's 100 times that concentration. So 200 micrograms per mil. Okay, so here then is our solution. How are we going to get from our starting concentration of 50 mg per mil to 2 micrograms per mil with just one hop along the way? In this particular case, we're going to be making intermediate that's 100 times more concentrated. So that step from our intermediate to the final is going to involve a dilution of 100-fold. We know that we need to make 500 micrograms, 500 microliters at that stage, So a hundredth of that is 5 microliters. So I'm taking 5 microliters from my stock, from my intermediate stock, into that. And so to get to 500 in the end, I need to add that into 495 microliters of water. Now, how am I going to get to my 200 microgram per mil intermediate in the first place? Well, this first dilution is a bigger step than the final second dilution, and that's useful if we got an expensive material. So when we're reducing the amount of waste material. If we'd made a larger amount to begin with, then we would have had more waste. Okay, so we've got to the fact that this is the intermediate that we need, our 200 micrograms per mil, and I'm suggesting to make 500 microliters of that. And the reason I'm suggesting that is, remember that our limitation, absolute limitation, is 0.1 microliters, and to play comfortably I'm going to pick 2 microliters. Our dilution is going to be 250-fold, and therefore we're going to need to have 2 times 250, 500 microliters in total in order to be able to accommodate taking that particular volume and then that dilution factor. So we're going to need to have 500 microliters in total, and that then allows me to transfer 2 microliters into 500 minus 2, 498 microliters, to give me my 500 total, at that intermediate solution. So those are the steps that I would have taken. You may have come up with a different version, and provided the calculations work in as straightforward a way as this, then that would be absolutely fine. There are no magic numbers. As I say, there are some that are better and some that are worse. And bearing that in mind, in our next video, we'll think about circumstances in which you need to make a number of different intermediate solutions, which may be, for example, a so-called serial dilution.